Hi, welcome to AI Sanity, and today I want to talk about the topic of what's going on with Anthropic and the U.S. government and Pentagon, because Anthropic seems to have started a little war with the Department of War. Department of Defense, Department of War, I guess it's 1940 again. Here's what happened. Anthropic is one of the three big frontier labs, the others being Google and OpenAI, who make foundation models. Anthropic makes one called Claude. Now, I've been pretty critical of Anthropic before because they've had a lot of, doomer adjacent stuff and even like comments from their CEO about AI being conscious, and that's all nonsense. But as far as the company goes, they're a pretty good one. They make it part of their brand that they're a responsible, ethical, restrained company that is willing to walk away from profit if that's the right thing to do, and they've said that repeatedly. Anthropic's Claude chatbot and Claude large language model are one of the best out there, and they're used by many businesses and government agencies, including the Department of Defense, Department of War. And that's where the problem comes up, because although Anthropic's Claude technology has been deployed by the Department of Defense, Department of War, it has been restricted by Anthropic. They haven't wanted it used for two things: domestic surveillance and autonomous weaponry. And that's entirely valid and entirely normal. Many companies put ethical blocks on what they'll allow their technology to be used for, and using it to fight an offensive war is a classic. Many companies just don't want their technology being used for that. There are defense contractors, and there are companies who don't want to be defense contractors. But this caused some problems because the Department of Defense, Department of War, decided that they did not like these restrictions, and they demanded that they be allowed to use Claude with no restrictions whatsoever for anything that they considered lawful, including weapons, domestic surveillance, and Anthropic did not agree to this. Now, I had written in my blog that this would likely cause Anthropic to have to deal with the fact that they may lose the Department of Defense as a client, as a customer. And under normal circumstances, that's what could happen. You could lose a big contract with the Department of Defense and it would go to somebody else. But that's not what happened here. Instead, the U.S. government reacted in a way that is just vindictive. First, the Department of War declared Anthropic, or threatened to declare them, a supply chain risk. They haven't officially done it yet, but they've said that they are going to. And that's unprecedented because a supply chain risk is normally used for an entity outside the U.S. that is hostile to the U.S., like a foreign company that might put something in the supply chain that could be dangerous, or some sort of spy software, something like that. So it's typically used for overseas companies that can't be trusted. It's never really used for domestic company, but by declaring it a supply chain risk, that's been called like capital punishment for the company, because that means that no company that does business with the Department of Defense, which is a lot of companies, most Fortune 500s in fact, would not be able to use it, and some of them have restricted using it. In addition to that, President Trump has signed an executive order telling government agencies to stop using Claude, which is a pretty big thing, right? If the U.S. government and none of its contractors can use it, that would be the death knell for the company, or so it would seem. But there's a little bit more to this, because there is a lawsuit being filed by Anthropic, which may very well proceed, because this is a very unusual and highly one-sided type of vindictive action. But there's a little bit more to it than that, because it's not entirely certain whether or not it's a realistic idea for the Department of Defense and its major contractors to break ties with Anthropic. It may end up costing them too much. Claude is a very unique and capable frontier model, and has capabilities like Claude Code, which are really useful, and the Department of Defense wants to use that, of course. The other question really is the bigger political picture. The United States has always said that AI and AI laboratories are a strategic asset, and they're part of the U.S. beating countries like China in AI development. If you start going to war and trying to undermine your own country's AI labs, well, that's not going to work. You're just sacrificing a huge part of your technology stack. But there's a little bit more to it, because after this happened, the night after this happened, almost immediately OpenAI did something that was about the worst optics imaginable, and they inked a big deal with the Pentagon, which makes them look extremely opportunistic and like they just want to get paid for fighting wars. The result has been a huge public swell of support for Claude and Anthropic. In fact, when this happened, more than 1 million people downloaded Claude to their iPhone. It became the most popular app in the iPhone store. And then in addition to that, people have been canceling OpenAI in droves. In fact, ChatGPT has been canceled. In fact, a few people have even resigned from OpenAI. Meanwhile, a number of tech companies have thrown their support behind Anthropic, and a lot of people have signed up for Anthropic's Claude service just to support it. So the plot is really thickened here. I really don't know what's going to happen because, as I said, I'm not sure it's really sustainable to call Anthropic a supply chain risk. Not only is it something that is causing a lawsuit, which may well succeed, but the country is really shooting itself in the foot by going after a frontier laboratory here. There's another thing, though, that's interesting, and that is that what they don't want is their technology used for autonomous weapons or mass surveillance, and that's almost a moot point, because Anthropic, OpenAI, and companies like it produce large foundation models, large language models, and these are not suitable for any type of autonomous weapon. Autonomous weapons really would never be controlled by the type of generative agentic AI that you think of with GPT or a large language model like that. Instead, they would have a very highly specialized, more deterministic, predictable AI if that were used in an autonomous weapon. And it's not likely that AI is going to really change the battlefield in that regard much. As far as surveillance, yeah, large language models and NLP can be used for that, but there is a little bit of an issue here, which is that for mass surveillance, large language models tend to be too computationally heavy to really deploy at extremely large scale, and there are much smaller models. Now, it really does, however, bring up a bigger question, which is the use of AI and foundation models by the military in military conflicts. As I said, these models are not used for autonomous weapons directly, and they're not likely to be used for direct surveillance, but they would be used for interpreting surveillance, interpreting reconnaissance and making decisions, logistical decisions, dispatching things. And apparently, despite the fact that Anthropic was declared a supply chain risk, within a few hours, the Pentagon was still using Claude as part of their Iran operations, allegedly because they're giving themselves a 6-month grace period to decouple, which kind of defeats the idea that they are a supply chain risk, doesn't it? But really, the question here comes down to this. Frontier models and generative models are not designed for military service. They're not designed for life and death. They're designed not for classified, hard-hitting environments, but to be friendly, helpful, non-confrontational, easy to work with tools for productivity. And that's just not necessarily the best thing for a military application. Certainly not for surveillance, not for battlefield information, reconnaissance, or interpretation. And the problem is that these models just aren't that reliable. They hallucinate. And so if you're using the model to determine where to drop your bombs, even if it's not dropping the bombs itself, you know, that's a bit concerning, because the other thing is, what we've seen is that even people in professional positions often really do not understand the failure modes and the hallucination potential that you get from AI. So it is concerning to me seeing frontier models and models that were not built specifically for military battlefield purposes being used for anything that touches on combat or decision making. However, at present, they're not really likely to be used for any sort of autonomous weapon or life and death decision making, although they might be used for dispatch and logistics, and that's where they could in fact hurt people if they get something wrong. So really, I think that eventually we will have more specialized models and models that are safer for battlefield use, but right now the question is, should we be using Claude? Should we be using ChatGPT at all in military applications that involve direct combat? And I don't think we should. That said, for now, all I can say is that I stand by Anthropic. I believe that companies like them have an obligation to fill their ethical, their ethical vision for what they want to be and not compromise on it, and I support their efforts. If they don't want their technology used in combat, they shouldn't have to allow that. You know, that it might be understandable if this were like a war of survival for the U.S., but it's not. It's not. And the people at Anthropic developed the technology. They know what it's good for. They know its limits. And they shouldn't be forced by the government to allow their technology to be used for purposes that it wasn't designed for and that they're not comfortable using it for. I encourage you to support Anthropic and to contact your senator or congressman and tell them that you're not okay with this. This is anti-competitive to the United States for its own ability to have frontier labs. We're going to war with our most strategic asset, our technology developers. It's unfair, it's vindictive, and you know, it begs the question if whether or not Anthropic has a point that these tools are not ready for active combat use. So I stand with Anthropic. I support them, and I'm 100% behind them in this. I actually just signed up for Claude myself in a show of support, and I think you should too. But I don't think this is over, and I think that in the end, Anthropic likely will prevail.